Hello, everyone. Now, I know that it's hard to keep up on top of what's going on in the Holy Land, but if you want to know more about what's happening here in Israel, I'm Aaron Porras, and this is the Weekly Review.
In the latest escalation along the Israel-Gaza border, a military IDF engineering unit came under fire while operating in the buffer zone near Kisufim Crossing in the south of the Strip. According to troops, shots originating from Gaza were fired targeting their armored bulldozer. While no injuries were sustained, the gunfire did damage the vehicle. In response, the IDF announced they had fired on Gaza rulers' Hamas military positions after warning local Palestinian farmers with leaflets to evacuate the area. The IDF said shortly after the altercation that the incident was under control. Well, the rulers of the Gaza Strip, Hamas, are banning Palestinians from visiting a U.S.-funded hospital in the Israel border buffer zone. The U.S.-based evangelical Christian group called Friendships built its tent hospital called Camp Gaza over the past year and a half. They said this week they were ready to receive patients. In a post on the project's Facebook page, its members wrote that they were anxiously awaiting the coordination of patients from the Ministry of Health in Gaza. But the Palestinians say it is not enough. They want the hospital to provide healthcare services like chemotherapy, blood disease care, and other treatments unavailable in the Strip. Patients needing these services have to seek treatment in Israel or the West Bank through a complicated permit system. Instead, the hospital said it was offering services already available in Gaza, which the Palestinians said was disappointing. Admin for the hospital say they are working on expanding services and that they hope to operate the facility for the coming decade. Well, after airstrikes targeted Iranian militia in Syria on Tuesday, a senior U.S. official is claiming that the Israeli attacks were carried out as a result of U.S. intelligence. While it's widely believed that Israel is responsible for many recent hits on Iranian targets in Syria, the public admission of coordination between Israel and the U.S. on these strikes is extremely rare. The U.S. official, who requested anonymity while speaking about sensitive national security matters, said Secretary of State Mike Pompeo discussed the airstrike with Mossad chief Yossi Cohen, and that they had a public meeting in a popular Washington restaurant, Milano, earlier this week. Britain-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said 40 people were killed in the Tuesday strike, including 9 Syrian troops, and the rest were Iran-backed fighters. It said 37 were wounded. Iran has new strategic missile bases on the shores of the Persian Gulf. According to local news reports, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps unveiling the new facilities in the country's southern region near the Strait of Hormuz. Top commander of the IRGC, General Hussein Salami, says that Iran's ability to defend itself is getting stronger, adding that this was just one of the, quote, several IRGC naval strategic missile facilities. The IRGC is designated by the United States as a terrorist organization. The comments and unveiling appeared to be part of a series of moves this week aimed at increasing Iran's leverage before Joe Biden becomes the U.S. president on January 20th. Meanwhile, the U.S. State Department is calling out Iran for expelling United Nations nuclear watchdogs. While Donald Trump famously exited the JCPOA nuclear deal back in 2018, the inspectors served as enforcers of international law, not necessarily of that deal. Iran's recent announcement that it has resumed 20% uranium enrichment, bringing them closer to a bomb, has caused its enemy countries to be cautious. 6 days. That's how long it's been since Israel entered its third COVID-19 lockdown since March. It was supposed to be in place for 2 weeks, but with the infection rate continuing to rise at shocking rates, it looks like we may have to stay home just a little bit longer. Hannah Rifkin reports.
Nearly 9,400 people were diagnosed with coronavirus on Wednesday, one of the highest numbers of new daily cases since the start of the crisis. Of the more than 120,000 people who were screened, 7.9% tested positive. This is the third day in a row with more than 9,000 new cases. Of the people in the hospital, 1,123 are in serious condition, including 280 on ventilators. 3,846 Israelis have died, including 49 on Wednesday alone. The country is also 1 week into a nationwide lockdown, but so far cases are not declining.
מספרים הם גבוהים, אבל הסגר אני חושב שכן משפיע. אני מכוון שנראה בימים הקרובים כבר את ההתחלה של הירידה. כמובן זה לוקח זמן, אנחנו נמצאים בתקופת הזמן הראשונה שהסגר אמור להשפיע, 6 ימים בערך אחרי התחלתו, כך שצריך עוד טיפה סבלנות.
Given the high rate of infection, the health ministry is expected to ask to extend the latest lockdown by at least a week.
אנחנו נעקוב אחרי המספרים האלה, גם של המאומתים וגם של החולים הקשים בשבוע הבא, ולפי זה נחליט על ההמלצה שלנו לגבי המשך הסגר. הערכה שלי שנצטרך להאריך את הסגר בשבוע נוסף, אבל נוכל לדעת בוודאות רק באמצע השבוע הבא.
The ministry has also said that any exit strategy would not happen all at once, but would be done in stages, beginning with the gradual opening of schools. Some officials are saying we may have reached a peak of the third wave of the virus and don't see a need to extend restrictions. Chana Rifkin, ILTV.
Well, speaking of our vaccination program, whether fast enough or not, it is the fastest in the world, and the world is taking notice, as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is again pointing out on social media.
We've seen the incredible speed and efficiency of Israel's vaccination drive, which is on track to vaccinate all over 16s by the end of March. So what discussions has my honourable friend had with his Israeli counterpart on replicating Israel's success, particularly in the areas of digitisation and accessibility?
I commend the Israeli government and the Israeli health service for a stellar job in vaccinating the most vulnerable communities, and we have a lot to learn from other countries, including the throughput, the speed at which they manage to vaccinate.
High praises from the UK, among other nations, looking at Israel for lessons in fighting the coronavirus pandemic, with Israel now having vaccinated at least 22.3% of the population in just about 3 weeks' time. But so what's the answer to the MP's query? How, in fact, did Israel get its vaccine campaign to work so quickly? Well, one factor was population size and density. For Israel, 20% of the population translates to about 2 million people, the majority of whom live in big cities and across an area about the size of New Jersey. This means that the percent vaccinated rises much faster relative to larger countries, and that it's cheaper and faster to deliver the vaccines to where they need to go without letting them spoil by temperatures above minus 70 degrees Celsius. Still, that's far from the whole story, too. Israel innovatively divided the vaccine shipments into smaller, more manageable sizes to deliver only what was necessary to each community and cut down on potential spoilage. As for administration of the doses, Israel's existing healthcare infrastructure played a very large role. Every Israeli must choose to be a member of one of 4 not-for-profit health insurance HMOs. And these same HMOs, rather than the government, are primarily in charge of organizing and personally contacting at-risk populations in order of priority.
אנחנו מקדימים את כל העולם בחיסונים, עם מיליוני החיסונים שהבאנו, וקופות החולים והמערך הרפואי שלנו עושים עבודה הירואית, שכרגע תגיע, אני מקווה עד מחר, מחרתיים לכל יותר, ל-170,000 חיסונים ביום שיא עולמי. אבל באותה עת אנחנו נלחמים גם בהתפשטות המחלה שהגיעה כבר ל10,000 חולים מאומתים ביום. זה קצב גדול מאוד.
But finally, Israel led the world in yet 2 other challenges. First, changing the attitude of the public away from skepticism and fear with an aggressive online and community-based information campaign. And second, simply receiving large stocks of the vaccinations through a number of partnerships and agreements with Pfizer-BioNTech and Moderna. Reports showing that Israel paid upwards of $20 more per person for the vaccines to ensure their priority delivery, while promising, at least to Pfizer, to provide the company with access to medical data and information about those who get the vaccine, essentially turning Israel into a testing ground for developing future vaccine strategies. Moving on, as we all no doubt already know, the coronavirus has been devastating across the globe, but the ecosystem and the environment in general is likely to feel the effects the most and for the longest time to come. PPE and masks in particular becoming the leading litter produced by the ongoing pandemic, as single-use plastic face coverings make their way to every corner of the earth on land and at sea. And tragic images popping up on social media show dead or injured animal life caused by getting caught in or eating said masks. But thankfully, there is at least a little something that we can do to help. For one, unless you really need them, opt for just washing your hands more often instead of wearing single-use gloves. And as for masks, try to switch to reusable cloth-based coverings if you haven't already, or at least cut the strings off of your single-use masks before you recycle them or throw them away. This will greatly reduce the number of animals ensnared by the straps. Now, in other news, with just a few weeks to go ahead of the new Joe Biden administration in Washington, some 800 new settlement homes are slated to be approved for construction in Judea and Samaria.
Confirming earlier reports, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is today authorizing the construction of hundreds of housing units in Area C of the West Bank, or the Israeli-administered regions of Judea and Samaria. This including 200 units in Ralim and Nofei and Chemia, 500 units across Itamar, Beit El, Shavei Shomron, Oranit and Givat Zev, and 100 units in Tal Menashe, the hometown of terror victim Esther Horgan, who was killed last month. Her husband calling for increased settlement construction in the wake of her murder. And other settlement leaders also hailing the new decision.
הבנייה והאחריות לבנות את הארץ שלנו, בדיוק כמו האחריות על הביטחון ועל הכלכלה, היא של הממשלה שלנו. יש דיאלוגים חשובים ממדינות רבות, כמובן ארצות הברית שהיא ידידה חשובה של ישראל, וישראל גם ידידה חשובה של ארצות הברית. זה צריך להשאיר לראש הממשלה ולהשאיר לנשיא ארצות הברית. אזרחי ישראל מצפים שיתנו להם לחיות ולבנות ולהתפתח בצורה טבעית וברורה, והאחריות היא על ממשלת ישראל לעשות את זה. זה לא עניין של מדינות אחרות.
But pushing back against the decision, lawmakers in the opposition, like Yesh Atid leader Yair Lapid, calling the move an irresponsible step, and tweeting that the Biden administration hasn't even taken office, yet the government is already headed for an unnecessary confrontation with the U.S. Likewise, Palestinian Authority officials calling the settlement illegal and an attempt to change the facts and narrative on the ground. Though that said, the facts on the ground have already been shifted. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo explaining in 2019 that the establishment of Israeli civilian settlements in the West Bank is not per se inconsistent with international law. Still, taking opposition one step further, Defense Minister and former Netanyahu partner Benny Gantz of the Blue and White Party is now instead approving permits for Palestinian construction in Area C, which is fully under Israeli control. And this in a dramatic reversal from previous rhetoric where Gantz himself said that Blue and White supports the legalization and construction of Israeli settlements in Israeli-owned land, with or without a permit.
Now, to begin, Sheldon Adelson, a close friend of Prime Minister Netanyahu's, passed away at the age of 87 from non-Hodgkin's lymphoma on Tuesday. The United States businessman and philanthropist was a well-known casino mogul and political donor, and his passing comes just after purchasing outgoing U.S. Ambassador David Friedman's home in Herzliya last week for over $67 million, as well as providing a private Aliyah flight for convicted spy Jonathan Pollard and his wife Esther at the beginning of the month. Prime Minister Netanyahu with some remarks in commemoration.
קשה לתאר את מה ששלדון עשה בשביל העם היהודי ומדינת ישראל. שלדון היה פטריוט יהודי ענק, והוא פעל לחיזוקה של מדינת ישראל, לחיזוק מעמדה בארצות הברית, לחיזוק הקשר עם התפוצות.
All right, now a troubling issue is now returning to the fore as individuals and governments worldwide begin to fear an incursion on their rights to free speech, and this following the permanent removal of President Trump from social media platforms. Shares of Twitter, Facebook, and Google's Alphabet Inc. now dropping dramatically to the tune of billions of dollars in the wake of the banning of President Trump from social media. Twitter and Facebook claiming that the move was over violations of their community standards and guidelines. The tweet in question, President Trump writing that the 75 million great American patriots who voted for me, America first and make America great again, will have a giant voice long into the future. They will not be disrespected or treated unfairly in any way, shape, or form. And, to all of those who asked, I will not be going to the inauguration on January 20th. Then this, in addition to the banning of alternative competing social media platform Parler from the Google, Amazon, and Apple app stores. But far from the only person or company to be abruptly banned from service and with little to no transparency, citizens worldwide are growing concerned over the true hold these companies command over free speech and the free marketplace itself. This as even libertarian former presidential candidate Ron Paul was blocked from his own social media account for calling out the chilling attack on free expression and exchange of ideas.
I mean, I think that's in the public commentary right now, trying to figure out how much clout should social media organizations have on the messaging. They've tried to do I think these companies try to do their best, but human beings are human beings. And, each one has their own political and social biases. So it's tough to ignore or tough to end around what the leaders of these organizations' bias are in what is the end product of the messaging. So it's tough to decide who's the police on that. Yes, they are private organizations, but because they do have so much clout in the world, it's a little bit of a seesaw to try to figure out, how to manage this. So I think there's, good, there's strong comments and complaints on both sides.
Chaim Siegel going on to add that the stock drop also reflects the expectations that legislation may soon follow, enforcing antitrust laws and maybe even revoking these companies' Section 230 liabilities immunity, which would have a devastating effect on their operations. And again, these concerns far extend beyond the borders of the United States, where these companies sit.
Das Grundrecht auf Meinungsfreiheit ist ein Grundrecht von elementarer Bedeutung. Und in dieses Grundrecht kann eingegriffen werden, aber entlang der Gesetze und innerhalb des Rahmens, den der Gesetzgeber definiert, nicht nach dem Beschluss der Unternehmensführung von Social-Media-Plattformen. Unter dem Aspekt sieht die Bundeskanzlerin es als problematisch an, dass jetzt die Konten des US-Präsidenten dauerhaft gesperrt wurden.
There is a general consensus developing in many places that it can't just be left to the tech platforms, because they are also driven by their commercial interests. So it's got to be some authority which is able to move quickly. And ultimately, I suspect the matter will have to be finally arbitrated through some sort of judicial process.
In other news, as clashes between Israel and some in the Arab world continue, other Arab nations are closer than ever with the Jewish state. Especially in the wake of the historic Abraham Peace Accords, and particularly on the individual level, things could not be better between Israelis and their Arab neighbors in the region. But not out of nowhere. The new ties are in large part thanks to Israel's aggressive social media campaigning. A small Arabic-speaking team organized within the Israeli Foreign Ministry, focusing solely on promoting interreligious relations and ending decades of hostilities.
Most of the countries in the Arab world don't have official relations with Israel. So the social media was like a big earthquake for us in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and it let us the opportunity to talk directly to audiences in the Arab world and to present the real face of Israel.
انتوا شايفين احنا موجودين في سوق محنة يهودا، احنا بنيجي على اماكن عديدة في دولة اسرائيل لنفرجي الحياة الاسرائيلية، حياة المواطن الحقيقي والبسيط في دولة اسرائيل والتعايش بين العرب واليهود مع بعض، وبهاي الطريقة احنا بنشكل سفراء في العالم الافتراضي لدولة اسرائيل، وعن طريق هيك ايضا بنبني جسور بين الثقافات بين الشعوب بعيدا عن كل السياسات.
I think engagement, interactions and dialogue with audiences in the Arab world is in top priority here in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And at the end of the day, Israel, its neighbors are Arab states. We are in the Middle East, and we need to talk to each other in order to understand each other better, in order to create a good basis for any future peace deals with our neighbors.
But with that in mind, the question then is, why did this push only begin fairly recently, with the unit established in 2011 but only ramping up its activities in late 2020? The answer lies in Egypt and Jordan. Israel wants to gain a broader Arab support than we get through these so-called cold pieces between Israel and these two countries, where the governments uphold all of the treaties, but where the citizens still largely reject normalization. And the change in tact is paying off. Research showing anti-normalization commentary in Arabic dropping from 90% to 75% in just the span of a few months, and with both Israelis and their new Arabic families sharing the same sentiments.
سافرت للإمارات، حسيت حالي أمان في أكثر بكثير من دول في أوروبا. الشعب الإماراتي شعب كثير محترم اللي بتقبل، يعني شعب اللي حتى هن كأشخاص في الدولة عايشين عندك أكثر من 200 هوية، اللي بتحس حالك حدا غريب، بتحسش حالك حدا اللي مش من هاي الدولة، بتحس حالك جزء من المحل اللي أنت فيه، بخلوك تحس إنك أنت في البيت.
It's the first time here to be in Israel. And we would love to say thank you for each and every person who welcomed us.
In other news, following decades of international efforts, the Franciscan St. John the Baptist Chapel is finally landmine free. And the Catholic Church is understandably celebrating. Hannah Rifkin with the story.
يعني هذا اليوم هو يوم تاريخي. يوم إن احنا من 54 سنة و3 أيام خسرنا هذا المكان بسبب الحرب، واليوم رجعنا بعد 54 يوم و3 أيام بنصلي في هذا المكان. فهو بالنسبة لنا احنا حراسة الأراضي المقدسة هذا يوم تاريخي إنه رجع هذا الدير، هذا المكان اللي كان في يوم من الأيام يوم حرب، مكان للحرب والدمار، صار مكان للصلاة، مكان واحد سلام، واحد صلاة. فهذا هو أهم شيء في هذا اليوم.
Long since abandoned after the 1967 Six-Day War and the 1973 Yom Kippur War, this holy site, where Jesus himself is believed to have been baptized, is finally reopened for full use. All it took was the concerted international cooperation, including from the Halo Trust, to remove over 6,500 landmines starting in 2018. Then, hailing the incredible moment, the small entourage of priests, Vatican representatives, guests, soldiers, and journalists took part in a historic Sunday Mass led by Father Francesco Patton, the custos of the Holy Land. And this followed by a trip to the nearby Qasr al-Yahud National Park and baptismal site, where millions of pilgrims have come to visit.
احنا على نهر الأردن، هون كمان اتعمد السيد المسيح، هون لحظة معينة جدا في تاريخ المسيحية، في تاريخ السيد المسيح، وهون كمان احنا كمسيحيين بنجدد عمادنا.
Meanwhile, keeping the positive momentum going, the hope is that several other church properties in the area will likewise return to full use, with the help of Israeli roadwork to connect the Israeli and Jordanian sides of the region, especially as the Halo Trust assures that the area is completely clean of any explosives, no matter what the remaining warning signs and barbed wire might say.
And that's it for ILTV's Weekly Review. I'm Aaron Porras. See you next week.